Welcome back to another video in the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. Right now, we're working on building out our first section of work, which is the basic register. In this video, we're going to wrap up part 2 of getting the user data back from the API. Now, if you're a Patreon supporter at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure you head over to get the latest source code. Either way, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you can follow along. And finally, as you think of suggestions, please leave them down in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. This is definitely going to help make this course better. Your feedback is really important. So even if you're not sure if it's a great idea or not, leave it in the comments. We'll talk about it. Okay? There's no dumb answers here. So let's get started. Here I have opened the TimCo Retail Manager project or solution and a number of projects inside of it. Now, you may have noticed I've switched over to Visual Studio 2019. I did a video that previously about how I was using it, and now I'm going to use it in this course as well. So there'll be a little bit of differences as far as look and feel go, but the biggest things for you probably is the code lens that you see in my application. You'll also now see in your application if you follow along and use Visual Studio 2019. So code lens is a big one, and that's that little indicator above a method that says where it's used and that kind of information. So that's the only really difference I think you'll see that's when you use it. So let's get started. So what we did last week is we wired up the API so that we have this user controller that returns, when you get by ID, it returns a list of user model, which is the user information. Now, in all honesty, it's been almost 2 weeks since I have looked at this code. And the reason why is I pre-taped the previous video about 2 weeks ago or more because I was going to a conference. So it's had a little bit of time to kind of grow stale in my mind. I had to kind of refresh myself. And that's actually a good thing sometimes because you get a perspective that's almost like a new perspective on your code. You can take that much time away. Now, I don't recommend doing it with work projects just because if you do, first of all, it can be difficult to get back in. And second of all, your boss probably isn't thrilled with the idea of you walking away from your code for 2 weeks. But in this case, the one thing I noticed right off the bat is we're getting this user model, which ID, first name, last name, email address, and created date about the user. That's great. And we're getting that based upon the ID we pass in, which is actually, we're not passing it in, we're getting it from the context, which is great, but we're returning a list. And that doesn't seem great. Because why would we have more than one user model for one individual person? I don't think we do. So I think what we need to do here is we need to return the first here. And then just return a user model, not a list of user model. That seems more like what we're looking for when we're asking for the information about this particular user. Now let's just verify that works, because that's always a good idea to do when you're first getting back into a project, is just verify that what you think you know, you know. All right, so let's go to our Swagger. And in here, I'll go ahead and authorize. Let's see if I can get it right this time. We get our token. Then come up here to user and pass in bearer and our token. And we'll try it out. And we get back the response body, which is one entry, one item, not a list of items, which is great. And that's first name, last name, email address, date created, and my ID. So everything is good now. And now we know we're returning just one object, not a list of objects or a list of one object. So now we can kind of pick up where we left off and start moving forward. The next step is we want to, in the user interface, in the login, down here where we actually log in, we say, okay, log in. If that works, we're going to try catch here. If that works, then get the rest of the information, which the rest of the information is this information. Nope. Wrong one. So the rest of the information is this one. Here we go. So this model right here, ID, first name, last name, email address, and created date. So that's what we need to capture on the other end. So let's do this. Let's create a new, let's shrink this down a little bit. Let's create a new item, our new solution item. So new add project. And we're going to add a new console, a class library, .NET framework, which that's in my recent list. I can just select that, which that recent list is kind of nice. I can also search for it here, class library, and then just make sure I chose the .NET framework one. Now I'm still using .NET framework. We've talked about this before, but I'm still using .NET framework because of the fact that this is simulating building something pre-.NET Core, because that's what most companies have in production today. And so we're going to build it up in .NET Framework, which is still a viable option. But then what we'll do is we'll move it over to .NET Core and kind of get experience doing that move. So this class library, I'm going to follow the pattern I have here where I said .library. So TRM desktop UI.library. And that's 472 framework. And we hit create. Now I'm creating a class library here because I don't want to use the data manager's library because it has data access. I don't want to give the user interface project data access. It's almost like I have two separate solutions here where there's this line underneath TRM data manager.library. There's a line underneath that, and everything below it could be its own solution. And then everything above it could be its own solution. So that's kind of what we're doing here. We're doing 2 in 1. Solutions don't really matter. And that's why we're doing it. Because we could have those two solutions, and that kind of make it a little bit cleaner as far as a separation visually. But when it comes to convenience, it's kind of nice to have everything in one project or one solution. So therefore, that's why we're keeping it in that one solution. And it just, we have to visually know that that's the difference, is there's a little bit of a disconnect here. Now, a class library is designed to share code between projects, but I'm not sharing class libraries, which may seem counterintuitive. And in some ways, we could argue that I could. But I really want to keep some things separate where they're not needed. I don't want to share code that's just not needed. So I'm creating a separate user interface library of code that will be for user interface support and will be things like talking to the API and that kind of thing. And I can use that between the various user interfaces that I have because we're going to add MVC and some other things as user interfaces. So there will be code reuse and code sharing through this class library, but it won't be with the backend. Okay? So that's just a little bit of a background of why I'm doing this. So let's delete class 1. And yes, we'll get rid of it permanently. And now I'm going to add a folder in here for models. And we're going to create a model in here. So a new class. We're going to call this model the logged in user model. And I'll make it public. And here's the thing that might concern you. I'm going to copy this and paste it. And you may have just twitched. And that's probably a good thing, okay? If you're a little concerned that I just copied and pasted 5 properties instead of reusing the model I already have, yes, that's a good thing to kind of question. We want to be dry. Don't repeat yourself. Okay, so that's what we're aiming for. But this is one of those places where we're not really repeating ourselves. Okay, and again, I kind of talked about this line between this project above and below this project as being 2 separate things, and they are. So a WPF application needs to have a model to catch the data that the API sends out. And the API sends out this data. So it really needs to match this data over here. Now, yes, again, I could take that DLL and try and use the same model. But the problem is they're not really the same. On one end, that's for capturing information from a database. On the other end, it's for displaying information about the user. There may be differences down the road that we want to add into one or the other. Things like maybe methods or maybe additional properties that don't get pulled from a database or additional properties that don't get sent from the API. What if, for example, we had more information in here about the user's activity, like an activity log? Well, that wouldn't come necessarily from the API. It's something we're capturing as they're doing things. So those are 2 separate things. And just because the code is the same doesn't mean we're repeating ourselves. And that's a hard distinction to make sometimes. But the distinction here is that they're 2 different purposes. So therefore, they're 2 different models. Okay? It's the same thing with, people get confused with MVC, Model View Controller, where you have front-end models, and can they be used, or should they be the same model as your data access model? And a lot of times the answer is they can be, but sometimes the answer is no, even though the data is the same or almost the same. They're 2 separate entities. One's for displaying data, one's for capturing data from the database. So just know that yes is repetition, and yes, there's a need for it. All right? So we have this model now, and we'll stick with just that for right now. But then let's close. Let's not get confused here. So let's close these other things. So here's our logged in user. Let's go to our view models and look at the login view model, which I believe is closed, but that's okay. So right down here, what we need to do after we authenticate, let's just put a comment in for right now. We need to capture more information about the user. All right. Now, we're going to need to put that information somewhere. And so we'll put that into our model. So to do that, we're going to have to call this API helper and get more information. Now, one of the things we said when we created the API helper was that we're not going to really put it in the user interface because that's not really where it should live. And that's true. We should move this out of the user interface and into our new class library. So let's create a folder in our class library. Let's call this API. And let's move the API helper and the IAPI helper. And I believe the password box helper needs to stay there. Yes, it does, because that is user interface specific and more specifically, WPF specific code. So now let's get rid of these two. Go ahead and delete them because we copied them down here. These are copies. And now we're going to have a problem in the fact that we have using statements that aren't necessary, and we're pointed at the wrong spot here. But notice if I control dot, it says add a reference to TRM desktop dot library is what the full thing it says. I say yes, and now that takes care of that. Let's go ahead and we need to check also. Well, that's a problem. So we've got TRM desktop UI.library.api is what it should be. Which this is a new thing with 2019. Is now notice my namespace. I can say change namespace to, and it will change that. And now that is correct. And I can come up here to my helpers and do the same thing where I change the namespace. And it should change everywhere. Now, Configuration Manager needs to be updated, which we need to install the Configuration Manager system.configuration in our DLL. So now that's added. And we still have another error here where our read async is not correct. We gotta find out the reason for that is. I believe it's an overload. Or actually maybe the wrong using statement here. So I believe that there was a different using statement for that one, which one it pulled from. And I believe that's because we don't have the web API NuGet package. So let's look at our desktop. Let's go to manage NuGet packages, make sure. Installed is Microsoft.asp.net or ASP.net.webapi.client. So let's install that down here in our library. So webapi.client. There we go. Once that installs, we'll also update Newtonsoft because that is badly out of date. There we go. And yes, we do have errors, and that's okay. Because it's saying I can't find the IAPI helper. And we just say, well, you can't find it because it's not there for you. So let's find out how to add it. Because right now my little assistant here is saying just generate. Do not do generate. Generate will actually create for you a new interface, a new class, a new nested class, new type, or new class in a new file. No, don't do that. Because then the error will go away and you'll feel great until you try to run something and it doesn't work. Because that's not what you're looking for. What you're looking to do is to find this IAPI helper, which is in this namespace. So let's see if we can just add the using statement for that. And it's saying, I don't know where that is. All right. So let's find out why. I'm guessing it's, let's start from the beginning. Using TRM desktop UI, but it does not have the reference to the library. So let's add a reference here and see if that's the solution. Projects, it's not actually referenced. So we check the box that says TRM desktop UI.library. And it says that's a circular reference. Aha. So what happened was, in my haste to fix things, what I did was down here in my library, I accidentally added a reference back to the desktop UI. Wrong direction. And I did that in here when I wanted to have this desktop UI.models, which was not correct. That should not be there. So let's go to our references and say add reference, go to project, uncheck the UI one. That's the wrong direction. Go up here to my references, add a reference to the library. The UI should always reference the library. A library should never reference the UI. And now in my iAPI helper, this authenticated user is not available because it's in the authenticated user's models class. Well, that's because it's in the wrong spot. Let's move it down here to our models, and we will delete it out of here and say yes, delete it. So we're moving things around, and yes, it breaks some things, it causes some problems, but it's better to do it now rather than try and do it later where it's going to break more things. So now I can add that reference back. And now notice down here it says no issues, kind of small, but you can kind of see per page if there's any issues, which is really helpful. Right, there's 2 issues still here. iAPI helper. Add the using statement. Now we're good. Now I'm going to do a build, and we'll see what breaks. Okay, we got 2 broken things. Right here. Add the using statement for the library API. And now that's good. And if we build it again, we should be good to go. Okay, so everything's moved over. Let's close everything and just kind of take a look at what we've done and where we're at. So we moved over the API helper, which right now all it does is has an initialized client, and which is called immediately on construction. And then it has authenticate. So initialized client, what it does is it creates a new HTTP client, which we'll use for the lifetime of the WPF instance we're using. And that's because you don't want to have multiple HTTP clients open. So you leave just one open. And then the authenticate method creates our form URL encoded content and posts to the token, which says, yes, it's successful. Therefore, we pass back the response saying, hey, here's the information about what you were asking for. You tried to authenticate. We're going to give you back this authenticated user, which is the access token and the username. Okay, so it gives us that back. Or it throws an exception if the response failed. So now we have that set up. We need to add another call in here somewhere that talks to the endpoint. Let's find it here. So in our TRM Data Manager, we have our user controller. We want to call this GetByID method, which is going to give us back that user data. So that's what we want to call. So let's create a method here called public async task, and we'll return back a model, which our model is the logged in user model. We'll control dot on that to add a using statement for that. And we're going to say get logged in user info. And we'll pass into it the user ID. That's that the ID that's returned back. No, actually, we don't even need to do that. We're not passing anything in because we have our token. Actually, this is a chicken and the egg kind of thing. So this right here is going to save for us our token information for future calls. But right now, we don't have that token yet, so we have to pass it in. So let's do that. So I'm going to pass it in. We need to capture that token also in our logged in user model, which we don't have. We have the ID, which is that GUID, but that's not the same thing. So let's create a token. That way we can capture that as well, or store that information, so that when we make future calls, we have that information to rely on. Because we have to make that token available for every call. So now what we'll do is we're going to modify this client that we use, which we call it API client. So API client, which, by the way, that is part of, as a private variable in this class. So API client, that's the HTTP client, just so we're aware. Okay, so we have added a header right here for request headers. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to copy these two lines and come down here and modify by adding one more. Now, yes, I'm doing a clear here and I'm adding one more. The reason we do clear is to make sure that that's all we have here. We haven't added something in a previous step or somehow otherwise stepped on our own toes. So we're going to add a new default request header. This is going to be an add. There we go. And we're going to say authorization. And you have to spell this right. And then bearer space. And we can, let's just do our string interpolation. So token, like so. So what this is doing is it's going to add a new header to our request. Now, if you're not familiar with the way HTTP works, the basics here are that you have your request header and your request body, two different pieces. And so you can, depending on the data and what it's for, you can either send it in the header or the body. In this case, what we're saying is for every call that you make, the default request headers, I want you to add the authorization bearer token. Now, what that will do is it will make sure that we send our credentials, essentially our credentials, along with every call, saying, yes, we're authorized to make this call. Now, it's not your username and password. That would be unsafe. This instead is a short-lived token that we got back after using our login in and password to get it. And so it essentially sits in place saying this is us. Now, one more thing, I need to actually do API client dot default request headers dot clear, like so. I'm not positive that this clears the accept as well, but I think it does. And so I'm going to make sure I clear that one too and add back in the accept. So that's why I'm doing both. I'm not positive you have to do that. And if you want to try it out without it and see what happens, cool. Do so and let me know what you find out. Okay? But that should work. Okay, so now we've put our token in place. And really, since this HTTP client lives for the lifespan of the instance of our WPF project, we shouldn't need to know the token any longer. Now, I'm going to keep it just in case we have to clear these headers out or for some other reason, but we shouldn't need to keep that long term. So now we have this done. What we can do is we can essentially make this call right here. We're going to copy right here. Copy and paste. But instead of post, we're going to do, let's look at this. I believe it's a get. It is a get call. GetByID, which we could be more specific here and say HTTP get. Not just saying that's a get call. So now it's the get call for the user controller. So it'd be /user. We're not going to pass any data in, and it's going to be a get async. And then from this, we can check the data coming back. If response.isSuccess status code, which it should be, we're going to say var result equals await response.content.read as async. We're going to read it in as the logged in user model. And then what we'll do is not return results, but that's what you'd think we'd do. In fact, we could even say result, but that's not going to be what we're looking for here. But let's leave that placeholder there for now. Then what we'll do is do an else and say throw new exception response.reason phrase. Why did it fail? And now this is in theory complete, but it's not quite. And the reason why is because we're going to get the logged in user info, but I don't want to just return it. In fact, I kind of want to not return anything. I want to return it as a task. And the reason why is because I don't want this just coming back to the login view model. That's not really helpful. What I want to do is I want to put this information, the logged in user model, I want to put that into a static class that everybody has access to. Well, not actually a static class. What we'll do is in our Bootstrapper CS, we have these singletons. I'm going to create another singleton for the logged in user model. But in order to do that, I need to have an interface. Well, I don't have to. What I could do, I'm not going to do this, but I could say singleton and then say logged in user model, control dot here to add a using statement for that, and then say as self, which just open and close parens. So essentially what that's doing is it's a little different in simple container versus autofact. Autofact says as self, but this just says, hey, use the model and go ahead and use that and register itself. So if you ever ask for logged in user model, you'll get back the same instance. But I don't want to do that. And here's the reason why. I debated this. I could just do this because it's just data. And so there's not a problem mocking here. But where the problem comes in is if I ever add to this model with other things, I might want to mock that. And so therefore, I do want to change this. I do want to have an interface just in case. So I create an interface with all the information this currently has. And I just say, okay, I'm going to leave it in the same folder. Now, this is also a debate. Whether you leave it in the same folder or you create a separate folder for all your interfaces, it's kind of up to you. But in this particular project, I think it makes more sense to put in the same folder instead of trying to get too complex. When you start trying to create this whole folder structure, first of all, it's not a one-size-fits-all. If you have a one-size-fits-all folder structure, you're either doing identical projects with identical size, or you're doing it wrong. My personal opinion. Because each project is different in size and scope. And so if you try and break it down the same way every time, sometimes it's just a round or a square peg in a round hole. It just doesn't work real well, but you try and force it that way because that's your personal preference. I would argue that we want to be as fast as possible, most efficient as possible. And so if we keep the interface with the implementation, then you know that these two go together. And it's very easy to see where the implementation is for this interface because it's right next to it. So in this case, since we're small right now, I say this is the way to go. So up here, I should just copy this and then type I and paste it and put a comma. And now there we go. Whenever I ask for an I logged in user model, I'll get back the logged in user model. And since it's a singleton, I'll get back the exact same one. How does this help us? Well, up here in the API helper, I am going to ask for an I logged in user model. And call it logged in user. That way, down here, I have that model. Now you might say, well, why do I want to use that model when we have this result here, which is the same model? But the difference is this is a different instance. And I don't want to mess around with my current instance. Therefore, I'll map the two together. Now I could bring a tool in like AutoMapper, which is a great tool. Lots of power, lots of use, and it's definitely great whenever you have data models and user interface models that hold the same or similar information and you need to map one to the other. Great tool for that, makes it very, very efficient. But in this case, we have one model we need to map. That's it. So instead of bringing in that extra code and all that setup, instead what I'll do is just map it manually. So we have our logged in user dot. I'm going to start going down through the list. And yes, this is a little tedious, but it's only a few properties. So it's not a huge deal. Notice the IntelliSense has kind of helped me out here, where when I select ID on the left and say equals, it goes to ID on the right. That's kind of cool. That's more intelligence than we have a right to ask for. There we go. Forgot my semicolon. And the token, we're not going to get from this call, but instead we'll get it from up here. And now you've updated the logged in user. Now we're not going to save it anywhere because of the fact that it's a singleton. Once we update it here, it's updated everywhere. So really we're done. What we're going to do is put a breakpoint right here. So the first time we call this, we're actually going to make sure that the results coming back are correct. But we haven't called it yet. So now what we need to do is we need to add this to the interface. So we can call it. Oops, can't have async here. There we go. Copy a little too much. Now back in our login view model, down here at the bottom, to capture more information, we're going to say await _ API helper dot get logged in user info result dot access token. Pass that token in. And that should be it. Now you've done a lot of code, a lot of changes, and have not run it yet. This is always a fun, nerve-wracking experience. Let's hit run. So we have our API loading. Once it loads, I'll pull out the page here. If they actually want to show just a login form, say Tim at IamTimCory.com. Make sure we get a password right. Hit login. Not found. So we got an error somewhere, but that not found is not the same thing as a login error. So let's make sure we get here. And then what we'll do is we'll come down to our if statement, put a breakpoint there as well. Hit login. We do get to the API helper, so that's good. The token is, I can't tell if it's correct or not, but it's at least a token. Hit continue. We do get to the response, and the response is a 404 not found. Okay? So 404 means it can't find that endpoint. Let's go find that endpoint for it. Swagger. User API / user. Let's make sure that that's what we're calling. /user. Now you may say we didn't use API / for token, and that's correct, /token. But for everything else, it's API /. Just for token, then it's not. So let's stop it. /API. And now I can run this again. Let's put our breakpoint here at the success status code. Let's wait for the whole thing to load. It's not quite, there we go. It's loaded now. We got to the status code, and the status code says true. Excellent. So let's hit continue, and let's look at the results. Result is right down here. So I can move this up a little bit. We have created date, email address, first name, last name, no token, that's okay. And our ID. We're not getting a token back from the call, but we're not actually worried about that because we're getting a token right here from the passed in information. So now I continue, and that form popped back up. There we go. So it worked. So that's it, really. That's a lot of tweaking, configuration, and changing, and it's really quite a shuffle. But part of that is because we had things in the wrong spots. We didn't have a library, which we should have. And so now we do. And the other part of it is it's a little bit more complex when you're working with bearer tokens. But don't worry, we've got that taken care of. Because right now it should be, now we have this right here, the add authorization bearer space the token. That's add every header. So now, from now on, we should be authorized as this logged in user. If for whatever reason we need to wipe out our headers, no problem. We can just ask for this logged in or I logged in user model in whatever class we want and log them back in. Not a problem. So we should be all set now to work with our API. So the next step is going to be, now that we've logged in, let's pull up the login view real quick. now you've used this login view to log in, which it hasn't given us any status back except to say we failed when we fail. But now you've logged in. What we need to do next is we need to close this out and go back to our shell view and open up probably the register. That seems like it's the right place to go. Or maybe we just don't open anything up. We'll have to figure that out. But I think we open the register up since that's probably the most commonly used thing. We'll put more things in this menu here, but the register is probably the next step. So what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to set up a eventing system. Caliburn Micro has a nice eventing system in place. And this is one of the reasons why I like Caliburn Micro is it brings a lot of these different tools in with it. Like it brings in the ability to use a dependency injection very easily. And it brings in other things. And one of the things is this system-wide eventing. And so we'll create an event and we will listen for it in the shell view and we'll broadcast it from the login view. The login view will say, new user logged in. And anybody that's listening will know that and can listen for that. But the one that's going to be the first to interact with it will be the shell view. Where it says, okay, since a person's logged in, I am going to open up a new form, a new register, and display it. And so we'll close the login form and open up a new register and put it in place of the login form. So that's what's going to happen next. Okay, so stick around for that next week probably, or the next video we have in this series. All right, until then, thanks for watching